He knocked the way guilty men do. 3 quiet taps that tried to apologize before I even opened the door. And I knew, by the quiver of the brass chain against the wood, that the past had finally found my address again. My name is Ruth. This house is older than my voice and holds secrets better than any priest. When the wind pushes at the stained glass above the stairwell, colors march across the hallway like a memory trying to be forgiven. Tonight, the colors were red. My mother used to say, that's what truth looks like when it's embarrassed. I didn't open for him at first. I stood there on the black and white tiles, bare feet aching from the cold, the late kettle clicking, its last warm protest in the kitchen. You learn a lot about a man by the way he waits, and though the years have taken from him what they will, height from his back, steadiness from his hands, his waiting was as elegant as ever, dressed in a long coat that knew money and a silence that knew how to negotiate. His eyes? Oh, his eyes were a winter field where no child should be lost. Ruth? He said, voice soft, like he thought my name might crumble if he pressed it too hard. It's Arthur, as though the house didn't know, as though my heart hadn't been spelling that name in the dust on these steps for 60 years. He left me once because I was poor, and now he's come back with pockets heavy enough to ruin a man. But I have learned, my dear, the one thing money cannot buy is what time took without receipt. The good years, the trust, and the breakfast he promised and never made. Before I tell you what I told him, come closer and let me set the scene, because I want you to feel the floorboards under our feet and the weight of the banister's curve under my old hand. There is a lamp in the hall with a cracked parchment shade that throws light like warm bread. There is a portrait of nobody important that watches everything as if it were. The house smells of lavender and old paper, with a memory of coal. And there, leaning where he always did when he was young and pretending not to stare, stands the umbrella stand with the lion's head. He used to put his hand in the lion's mouth and say, "See, Ruth, courage." He was 19 and the son of the great Ashdown line. I was 16 and scrubbing the Ashdown steps with a brush and a bleeding knuckle. The chain on the door held. I held it too. "What do you want, Arthur?" I asked, though wants are always the same really. To be forgiven or to be understood. He took a soft breath. Money teaches you to breathe in a certain privacy. And then he began to talk. But I couldn't hear his words just then, because my own voice had begun to sing me backwards. To the girl I used to be, the one with flour under her nails from borrowing the cook's kitchen to bake a loaf with her last pennies. Because if you bring a man warm bread, he will feel loved, even if you have nothing else to feed him. I met Arthur when this house didn't belong to me. I met him when I belonged to the stairs, and the coal scuttle, and the bucket, singing against my knee. He was all the things stories warn girls about, when those stories are told by women who remember the shape of their own mistakes. He came into rooms as if permission was his birthright. He could tell what you needed by your shoes, and yet he looked at me with a kindness that felt like I'd been offered a window, even if my view was of his back as he walked away. Forgive me, my dear. Sometimes I wonder. It's what old houses and old women do. If this story has touched your heart even a little, do subscribe and stay with me through the end. It helps me keep the kettle on and the lamp bright for nights like this. Now, Arthur's mother had a laugh like a locked drawer. His father was the sort of gentleman whose portrait was always taller than the man himself. Arthur would slip down to the scullery when the dinner guests were too loud and the strings too sharp. He'd sit on the cold stone steps with me and share the cherries he wasn't supposed to eat before pudding. "If only, Ruth," he'd say, pressing a cherry against his lower lip like a secret. "If only we were both born in the same room at the same time." Then we'd both have to scrub the floor. I'd tell him, and he'd laugh. And that was the first time I believed that laughter could upholster a room. By summer, we were in love, as far as two children can be when they are practicing on the first real thing that doesn't color inside the lines. He held my hand in the pantry and said all the words small princes say when they forget their crowns upstairs. He kissed me behind the door that always sticks in the afternoon and swore he didn't care that my father was a ghost and my mother a seamstress who stitched until her fingers were sermons. He told me to wait. He said we would run. There's that word again, courage, and find a village where his name didn't matter and my poverty wouldn't be introduced before I walked into the room. He promised a cottage with a blue door and a yard for tomatoes and a place where I could sleep without hearing the silver spoons count themselves. He promised me the simple things the rich never understand are the hardest to procure. He promised, and I believed, not because I was foolish, but because belief was the only luxury I could afford. It was August, the kind of August that hangs your shirt out on your bones and lets it dry there when everything went quiet. The invitations arrived at the house with blue ribbons, and the violinist rehearsed under the apple trees, and his mother had the garden cut like a suit. Lady Evelyn Hartwell had a surname like an inheritance, and she wore her hair like she knew it. She was kind to the maids the way ladies are when someone they like is watching. Arthur walked through the hall that week as if he were moving through a painting he hadn't posed for, or a prayer someone else had written in a language he barely understood. When I finally caught him alone, he had the ashtray fingers of a boy who's suddenly taken up smoking. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Lovers never look at you when they are about to betray you. They look at the floor, as if the ground was suddenly the most interesting story they'd ever heard. Ruth, he said, voice polite like a letter with a stamp you don't want to lick. I can't do it. I can't choose hunger. He tried to smile, the way you smile for a camera you paid too much for. You deserve more than a life with me, while I become less. He said it as if he was saving me, as if swapping me for a dowry were an act of charity. He left me because I was poor, not because he was weak. He would have liked me to think. I did think it for a while, until I learned that poverty has a way of clarifying where the weakness really lives. Is that your voice? I asked him. Or your mother's, wrapped around your tongue like a laced boot? He didn't answer, and the floor, bless it, creaked the way it always did under truth. I had a little money in a jar, and it was meant for the cottage we'd promised each other in whispers. That night, while the house slept, I counted the coins like little seconds I could spend twice. I put them in my apron and carried them like a sacrament to the scullery, where the moon poured itself on the table like milk. I cried the way you cry when the thing you've loved is still alive somewhere in the house and you keep hearing it, the way a kettle simmers when you've forgotten it and the water scolds you gently for the neglect. He married Lady Evelyn in a church that had my footprints in its nave from all the times I'd cleaned the candles. I watched from the back, with hands sticky from sugar, because cook needed help with the cake that would take up a whole table and then be remembered for only 5 minutes on a tongues. I bit my lips until I tasted iron. When the vows were done and the glass rang out and the white confetti rose like a pale storm, I turned and went back to the house that didn't belong to me and wiped every surface, as if I could cleanse the world of what had just been said with clean water and soap that smelled like lemons. A week later, I learned I was with child. There it is, the heart stopping in the middle of a sentence and starting again with a different name. The world does this to women. It hands us a secret and watches what we'll do with it. I had no intention of telling Arthur. He had made his choice, and I had no intention of letting his mother feast on the knowledge that her line had tangled with mine. It was my boy inside me. Mine. Mine in a way nothing in the house had ever been. Not the rooms, not the windows, not even the air. He kicked like a small bell when I told him stories in the night. I told him about the blue door we'd never... I have. I told him his father had eyes like winters we would avoid. I told him I would stitch the world together until it fitted him. I left the Ashdown house in the autumn and took lodgings 2 roads over with a widow who kept 3 cats and a sour face and a soft heart she defended with a broom. I earned what I could. I sewed until my fingers were bandaged like soldiers. I took in bread, in washing, in any kindness willing to be disguised as work. The morning my boy arrived, the sky was an inkwell spilled across the moor. He cried once, and then, the darling, hush, his mouth finding me like a conversation he already knew. I named him Daniel, because I liked the sound of it when said softly in the dark. He looked like Arthur, the way boys look like the men they've never met and will become or refuse to be. I told myself 100 times that it wasn't so, and the 101st time I believed me. You must forgive me for that lie. It kept me warm when there was no coal. We lived years here in this house, because life is a long corridor with many doors, and the one you think is locked will sometimes open when your knuckles are bleeding and you've nearly given up knocking. When the last of the Ashdowns died, years later, after a storm, after a scandal that smelled like stale sugar and spilled wine, the house passed, by a quirk of compassion and a clause in a will that even their lawyer couldn't entirely explain, to a woman who had stitched under these rafters and returned the lost watch of the old Lord Ashdown without asking for the coin inside. That woman was me, so here I am, the lady of a house I once scrubbed. There is a satisfaction to sweeping your own floors, with a bristle that doesn't draw blood. There is a holiness to making tea in a kitchen, where the ghosts have finally agreed to share the table. Daniel ran these halls with his shoelaces undone, and his laughter like water thrown at summer. He stuck his finger in the lion's mouth and never once asked it for courage. He didn't need it. He had mine. Tell me, have you ever forgiven someone who broke your heart? I'd love to hear your story too. Put it there, under the porch light in the comments, so we can warm our hands by it together. Before I say what happened to my Daniel, no, let me not rush you. Let me breathe. The house asks for patience when it wants the truth to arrive dressed properly. Arthur's life went on, of course. His name was printed in papers that used to wrap my little market apples, the ones I would pick with such care, sniffing them like letters from an old friend. He was photographed beside men who built empires on scaffolding that sang in the wind. He shook hands with a mayor in a coat that cost what a good woman earned in 2 months, leaning over a sewing machine. He had a son with Lady Evelyn. They named him Charles, and the boy grew up without learning where the kitchen was kept. Meanwhile, Thomas arrived in my life. Oh, Thomas, tall, quiet, with a limp that tapped out the shape of the war on my floor. He came on a Tuesday to fix a door that had been sulking since winter. He knocked it straight and then looked at me with the clean respect men give when they've decided to be decent on purpose. Daniel was 5 then, asking for peaches we couldn't afford. And Thomas brought a brown paper bag to our next encounter and said, as if it were nothing, "They call these bruised, but they taste like their sisters." I did not fall in love with Thomas like I had with Arthur. There were no cherries stolen, no promises wrapped in urgency. It was a small kindling that the softest breath could have blown out, and yet it grew into something that warmed us without burning. He knew I had a past and didn't prod it. He taught Daniel how to tie those laces. He taught me how to rest without apologizing for it. Once, when the roof leaked, he climbed up with a hammer and curses on his lips that made the rain behave. He had the sort of shoulders you could finally set your life down on, if you could bear the relief. We married in this very hall, the lion's head polished to a shine, the window light full of sugar. Daniel stood between us with a buttonhole he stole from his own pocket and insisted on pinning it to Thomas's jacket like a knighthood. The widow who'd helped me at dawn wrapped us in her old shawl while we said the sort of vows that begin with ordinary words and end with bread and company. It was a good life. I could fold it and put it on the chair and be proud of its creases. But life does what it does. It lets the past in by the window when you've barred the doors and told the dogs to hush. The first time Arthur returned to this address, he didn't knock. He sent an envelope. It lay on the mat like an accusation. Inside, a letter with his name, his handwriting, careful as ever, each letter uniform. The way rich men write when they want plebeian hearts to behave. Ruth, it said, I have learned who owns the old house now. How extraordinary, how entirely deserved. There were other words. It would mean a great deal to me to see the place again. He did not write the word forgive. Men like him learned early the nouns that common tongues mistake for verbs. I put the letter in the drawer under the teacups, where I keep things that have to live with their own company until they hum themselves asleep. I did not tell Thomas, not because I kept secrets from him. I didn't, not the kind that matter, but because the past can be like a bad actor. The minute you call its name, it performs for you, and the applause never belongs to the person who paid to see the show. I let the letter yellow, and the house made its soft little noises at night like it does when it consents to protect you. Years went by. Daniel grew into the sort of young man who held chairs for old women and maps for travelers. He went to work, not for Arthur. Fate is more original than that. For a contractor who had a contract with Arthur's company. There's a difference. But at night, when lawyers sleep, those differences crawl under the covers with the men who made them and get cozy. Daniel had a gift for heights. He could dance on scaffolding while the sun knelt in worship. Come down, I'd shout, laughing, half crying. You'll kill me with the looking. He'd blow me a kiss. Ma, he'd say, the sky's the only place no one's trying to own. One day, that sky slammed its fist against a building, as if to say, look at me when I'm speaking to you. The wind ran at the structure, like a rumor it had to confirm. The bracing on the fourth level gave. The boards let go of their faith. Daniel, my Daniel, fell 1.5 stories. Only that, and found with his ribs the steel that wasn't where it should have been, but was exactly where budgets decided to leave it. He did not die that day. Forgive me. The way I tell it sounds like he did. He lived, but part of him stayed there, on that ordinary Tuesday, in that sawdust and noise, while the rest of him came home to me, limping in spirit. He smiled because that is what men do for the women who raised them, to pay back some small portion of the nights they were sung to, and the bread they didn't notice. He smiled in the evenings, and in the mornings, when the sun was a little unkind. He sat quietly with his tea and watched the light move across the floor as though it might reveal a trick. Thomas carried him up the stair when his hip refused their usual agreement. The house was loyal, as only houses are when they have witnessed your whole life. It made space for our grief, the way old friends make space on a cramped bench. Arthur's signature appeared on the report that explained why the bracing had not been checked twice, why the steel had been ordered from the cheaper firm that also had the right cousin. His name was one line among many. but my eye found it as a swallow finds the dawn. In any language, the man's name meant the thing I had already lost twice. Do you see, my dear? Do you see how it was not just the cherries, or the promises, or the August music? Do you see how betrayal has a way of investing in itself and paying interest over the years? Arthur knocked tonight because the story had finally reached him. "I've come to make it right," he said through the door, the chain still holding. "I know what Charles's board approved. I've seen the audit. It was not how we do things. It was not my signature, but it was my name. I should have been watching. I should have kept them honest. Ruth, I didn't leave you because you were poor. I left because..." And here he stopped, because the words he had rehearsed did not sound like anything you could say through wood and brass to a woman who has awakened every dawn for half a century, with your choices under her tongue like a bitter pill. "Because what?" I asked. And my voice then, my dear, was not cruel. It was not even sharp. It was very tired. The kind of tired that turns a woman's hair silver and a kitchen chair into a throne, because she's finally too wise to stand for things that ought to kneel. "Because I was told you were stealing," he said at last, "from the pantry, from the guests, by my mother. She showed me a ledger, entries in your hand." He breathed that trained private breath. "I know now it was the cook's. Girl, I know what my mother arranged. I am telling you the truth. I chose safety. I chose the easy house. I chose cowardice and put manners on it. I've come to ask you not to hate me anymore. I've come to give you whatever. There, such men take refuge. In checks, in zeros, in properties that have windows, like ships. You cannot afford what I might ask," I told him, and the door trembled a little, but did not yield. "The price is Monday mornings. I cannot give Daniel back. The cost is a boy, learning to live with a back that tells time with pain. The fee is for the years my stomach forgot the meal's name, because I fed him bread and went to bed with my hunger, and my hands and your name." He said my name again, and it fell to the mat like a coin. I opened the door then, just enough for his face to find me, the chain still fast. He was beautiful still, in the way men are when they have read every book on remorse, and none on repair, lines like careful strings around his mouth. Eyes, those winter fields. He cried, "I think..." No, not I think. I know. A tear left his eye daringly, like a gentleman who forgot his hat on the train, and only realizes as his station slips by. I have always been soft about tears, but grief has taught me to audit them like accounts. "Our house remembers what your mother wrote in her ledger," I whispered. "Would you like to see what else it remembers?" I could have told him about the drawer where his letter slept. I could have shown him the hairbrush, with my mother's name carved under the handle. But the truth is, there is one thing upstairs that does more than any courtroom, and it was not something he came prepared to face. The house has a room we do not use on Sundays. The window looks onto the garden in a way that makes you think the leaves are gossiping about you. In that room, in a trunk with a lock that lost its key and learned to prefer it, there is a ledger, not his mother's. No, the ledger kept by his father's steward during those years when the Ashdowns employed their name as a net to catch what wasn't theirs. It lists wages trimmed, maintenance deferred, safety checks signed by a hand that preferred rings to ink. And there, near the back, a note that would bring a certain board to its knees, if read aloud with microphones present. I found it when I became mistress of this place. Every house has a throat if you know where to press, and this one cleared itself the day I moved in. "Ruth," he said, "what do you want me to do? Tell me, and it's done." "Done," I repeated, and I looked at him through the halo of the lamp's cracked shade. and the long patience of a woman who has buried two versions of herself. Arthur, my dear boy, the door is chained because it has to be. If I remove it, it lets in not just you, but all the stories we haven't told. Are you ready for the house to speak? He closed his eyes then, and he nodded. And it was not the nod of the man I had kissed behind a pantry door. That never behaved. It was the nod of an old man, asking permission from an old woman to sit with his sins. The lion's head gleamed. The window sighed. The stairs, hearing names it knew, creaked in welcome or warning. I couldn't tell which. My dear, before I continue, if this story has touched your heart even a little, do subscribe and stay with me through the end. Sometimes the only thing that keeps an old voice from breaking is knowing someone will catch the pieces and hold them for a moment. I slid the chain free. The brass made its little complaint. The door opened. I did not invite him to the kitchen. Kitchens are for people you are feeding. I did not invite him to the sitting room. It had seen too much of my laughing with Thomas to be turned into a confessional for other men. I took him to the room with the gossiping leaves. He paused, as we all do when a place remembers our feet. He looked at the portrait of nobody important and seemed to shuffle the deck of his expressions until he found the one that said, I will be brave now. I leaned down, with a softness the years have not taken from me, and pressed my hand to the trunk's lock, where a key once lived and now doesn't. The trick with old locks is this. They open not to force, but to recognition. Hello again, I whispered to it, the way you do to a dog you once used to mind for a lonely neighbor. It opened. The ledger was inside. I set it on the table. It smelled of ink and rain. Arthur's hands hovered above it like a congregant, above a fire much too honest for his confession. Read, I told him, and he did. He found his father's name. He found his own. He found the note that said, in a tidy hand that thought itself civilized, See, Ashdown authorizes the reduction of safety checks to quarterly. Cost saving will fund Hartwell Alliance hospitality. He read it again. He put his finger to it, as if he could smudge the letters into a kinder story. He looked up at me, the way a boy looks up when he has run out of lies, and discovered the truth is also a lie that belongs to somebody he loves. What do I do? He asked. First, you stop sending letters, I said. You stop asking me to meet you in the kind of restaurants where bread costs a day's work. You stop thinking forgiveness is a document. You go to the church on the corner, the one with the roof your name promised to fix and never did. You stand in front of the town and you say your father's name, where it belongs, and your own, and the truth, with all its dust and all its coins. You sell whatever could be sold to pay for what could have been prevented, and here I shook a little, and the house put its palm in my back like an old friend. You go to the graveyard and tell Thomas his limp was not a coincidence, and that his kindness was not wasted on those of us who had none to spare. He nodded again, the nod of a man who doesn't know how to count anymore, because his sums no longer add up in a currency the world uses. Anything else? He said, voice small, and there it was. That boy with the cherry between his lips. Daniel, I told him. The name broke me a little. He heard it. You go to Daniel. You look him in the spine and you say the name of every decision that got heavy there. You sign what needs signing and you watch the lawyers as if they were children with scissors. You deliver, not apologize. He wiped his face with a handkerchief that had never learned to do any kind of work, and then he folded it squarely, as if it were something else entirely. I can do that, he said. And as for me, I asked, and though I am a gentle woman, I let the silence stretch until it wrapped around his ears and made them ring. As for me, Arthur, what of the girl who cleaned your mother's tears off the silver she used to polish her lies? What of the woman who watered grief and grew a life out of it without your seed or your mercy, and with only the water she could steal from her own eyes. He did not answer, because there is no answer. There is only the sound of the house when it stops pretending not to listen. The pipes settling like old men after a walk. The wind moving in the porch as if it were dusting the chairs we haven't sat in yet. I can't afford you, he whispered at last, and the words were truer than he meant them to be. Whatever you ask, I can't buy. No, I said, because we are finally honest in this room. No, you can't. He looked at me then with those winter fields, and for a moment, only a moment, because I am not a fool, I saw the boy again who had wanted to run away, and the man who might have, if the world had been kinder, or he had been braver. He reached for the ledger. May I take this? No, I told him, and I put my hand on it with the soft authority a woman learns when she has become the archive of her own story. It stays with the house, but I will bring it on the day you stand up and open your mouth to the air. I will read it if your voice fails you. He laughed. Funny laughter, like a glass cracking, but deciding to keep holding the water anyway. I don't deserve that, he said. Deserve is a church word, I told him, smiling even though my heart had a habit of not doing that in this room. We are older than churches, you and I. We are older than deserve. We are the age of floors and coal and bread. Now go. He went, carrying nothing he had brought, and everything he hadn't meant to. The house exhaled when the door shut. I sat on the stairs and pressed my cheek against the polished wood that once was a tree, and once before that an idea in the forest, and I let myself feel both lighter and heavier, because forgiveness, my dear, is a seesaw when you're old. One end up, one end down. You learn to sit in the middle and keep the air from making a fool of you. When Thomas died, the limp winning the argument his heart had tried to prevent, I learned to eat alone. I learned to set a spoon for memory. Daniel visited and brought laughter like a jacket he made me try on, even in summer. We survived the sort of quiet that makes you wonder if clocks will one day admit they were invented to keep widows from going completely mad. And then, a winter ago, an envelope arrived with the Ashdown seal broken, because of course, inside was a single photograph of Arthur, older than even he had a right to be, holding the hand of a little girl with hair that had been taught to behave, and eyes that were not a winter field at all. Her eyes were spring. The note was short. My granddaughter. She likes stories. She likes lions. I folded the photograph carefully and put it in the drawer where I keep things that would, if misplaced, ruin me on a Thursday. And tonight, he came, and he read, and he said he would do what needed doing. Will he? I have seen men return to the old, soft couch of their excuses and call it a home. I have seen them decide that the cost of public truth is too high, and then pay, with interest, in some other currency that buys them loneliness at a good rate. But I also, I confess, have seen change. I have seen it move through this town like a woman who finally found the key to a lock that everybody said was ornamental. It is late, and the kettle has asked me twice to stop ignoring it. If you are still with me, my dear, put your name in the lamplight below and tell me where your sky lives. US, UK, Canada, Australia. Tell me if your rain sounds like mine. Tell me if your house listens. And tell me, have you ever forgiven someone who broke your heart? Not the way magazines mean, but the way floors do. Knot by knot, board by board, with nails you either pull out or learn to walk around. I would like to hear how you did it. I would like to know what it cost you, and whether the change in your pocket still jangles at night. Tomorrow, if you wish, I will tell you what happened when Arthur kept his word. Or if he did, I will tell you about the church that smells like old songbooks and how truth behaves in those pews. I will tell you about Daniel's back and what a settlement can and cannot buy. I will tell you about a granddaughter with spring in her eyes who asked the lion in my hallway the question nobody ever thought to. For now, the house has asked me, gently, to rest. It has put its hand in the small of my back and said, "Enough, Ruth. You have earned sleeping like someone who will wake and remember." Morning arrived at the windows like a shy apology, pink and late, the light catching dust that had not been invited but had been faithful nonetheless. I woke with the house's careful hand on my shoulder, as if it feared I might startle and scatter. The kettle offered its small hymn. My bones answered with their own. The lion at the door looked at me the way he always does in the early hours, stern, a little amused, as if he's seen every kind of courage, and still likes to be surprised by the smaller ones. I put the ledger on the table and watched the lamp fall across its spine. You would think a book that has broken so much could be proud of itself. Books are better than that. They simply wait to be read or forgiven. I pressed my palm against the cover until the paper warmed and smelled like school and rain. The note, the one that funded a wedding with stolen safety and taught my boy the weather from the inside of his back, was there between the pages like a thorn nesting in cloth. Truth has a habit of touching you. Where your clothes are thin, I washed Thomas's cup and set it by the stove to dry. I still dry it as if he might come back from the shed, rubbing his hands and asking if the roof kept its temper through the night. Grief is a room you learn to move through with the lights off. You know the furniture by heart. You don't stub your toes anymore, but you remember the time you did and how that big toe swore vengeance in language you did not know you possessed. The church bell kept its promise to 8 o'clock, and then a second bell, my little telephone, in the hall that pretends not to be vain, discovered its voice. The vicar is the only man in town who still says my full name. The way your teacher did when she was about to hand you back a paper, you knew you'd failed, and somehow you still wanted to please her. "Mrs. Ruth Ashwell," he said, which is short for I know who you were before the house called you home. "We'll open the nave from past. There are more than I expected. Will you bring it?" "I will," I told him, and the ledger on the table seemed to lift its chin a little, the way soldiers do when told the parade will be in the sunshine. "Are you well?" he asked, a kindness Englishmen do in a voice meant for weather. "As well as the truth allows," I said. "Do you know, Reverend, how the old boards sound when they're ready to hold weight?" He laughed. "I do. Bring your weight. We'll hold it." I hung up and smoothed my skirt. Some women dress for war, in steel and armor, and a mouth full of slogans. I put on Thomas's cardigan, the one the moths left, because they knew I loved it more than anyone. It smells of cedar and promises that kept themselves. The house approved. You may think me fanciful, my dear, but houses learn the risks of their women. They notice the cardigan that has been cried into, and the boots that mean business. The banister gave a small, encouraging groan as I descended, the sort you give your grandchild when they are trying to pull off their own sock for the first time, and you want them to feel the victory, even if you could have done it in half the time. Daniel arrived just after 9, carrying a loaf of bread, not because I needed it, but because men like to bring something to rooms they can't fix. He kissed my cheek and peered at the ledger, then at me, the way sons all over the world check that their mothers have not made themselves smaller while they slept. He is a handsome man, my boy. He wears his scars like buttons he did not choose, but learned to fasten with dignity. When he sits, his body negotiates with the chair. They always come to terms. "You look like you've been awake since the sun was thinking about it," he said. I've been awake since the house told me. To behave, I answered. And he smiled because in this home, we take it seriously when inanimate things express opinions. He glanced at the lion. He's glaring. He's practicing, I said. We're going to need him. You're going. He leaned in his chair in that particular male way of pretending he is casual with the thing he cares about very much. You're going. To stand with him. I'm going to stand with the truth, I said. He can stand where he likes. His jaw did a thing it does when he is trying to find the line between protection and permission. He has never quite forgiven me for being human. Sons are like that with their mothers. They prefer us immortal and always home by the time the streetlights pop. He left you, he said, voice quiet, as if the house might object to being reminded. He left us all those years ago because we couldn't afford his napkins, because he couldn't afford his courage, I corrected, and because we were poor, yes, he couldn't afford me then. He can't afford me now. I'll go, all the same, because price and worth are letters in different alphabets, and I speak several. He reached for my hand. His fingers are Thomas's. Work, certain in them. Kindness perched there like a bird that trusts the branch. You don't owe him anything. I owe myself the sight, I said. And you. Don't mistake me, boy. This isn't forgiveness. This is accounting. He laughed then, because he knows how I tell jokes under my breath. He stood, kissed the top of my head, just where my hair refuses to be sensible, and took the ledger. I'll carry it, he said. It's heavy. It is, I agreed. And the book didn't disagree. My dear, before I go further, if you're still with me, let me tuck my hand in yours for a moment. If my story has made your chest remember something it hid from your eyes, do stay, subscribe, as you young ones say. There are parts ahead that are lighter to lift when many hands are present. We walk to the church the long way, past the shop that sells the dresses I finger and never buy, past the chemist that carries the smell of menthol into the street like an advice you didn't ask for, past the bench where Thomas once untied his boot and discovered a hole that had been faithfully carrying him without complaint. The town was already pretending not to watch us. People are kind that way, when they don't know which kindness to choose. The church is older than gossip. The pews have been polished by 1,000 backsides that never met but share a certain hopeful shape. The hymnals carry the notes of people who sang for God, and a pay raise and a good harvest, and the miracle of nobody noticing they were there. The vicar caught my eye and nodded. He had put flowers from his own garden near the font. They were earnest blooms, unsure of themselves, but brave. The nave filled with the town's tuneless breathing. I saw the widow who saved me when Daniel arrived furious at the world. She still wears her sourness like a hat. People will respect, but her eyes are a soup recipe with a secret. The baker stood with his hands in his pockets, as if the dough might phone him any second and demand he return. The foreman from the site, where my boy fell, sat on the edge of a pew, like it might buck him. Arthur arrived late enough to be noticed, and early enough to be forgiven for trying. He wore a coat that belonged in a photograph nobody took. He looked lost in it. For a man who has made maps of entire markets, he has never been good at locating himself. Lady Evelyn walked beside him, and my breath did a strange little curtsy. I resent and understand. Her hair has made a life of being admired. She was paler than I remembered, and her right hand trembled, the way a leaf does when it's grown bored of pretending to be a leaf. Charles came too, a catalogue wearing a face. If you've never met a man who believes the world is a room arranged correctly, as soon as he enters it, you've been spared a particular fatigue. He looked at me, the way you look at an invoice you wish would stop arriving. The vicar cleared his throat, the nave gentled itself, and Arthur stepped forward. He had left his cane at home. which is how I knew he meant to do this, without leaning on anything that would make him look interesting. He began to speak. At first, it was the sound of a man reading instructions on how to make toast in a toaster he designed but never used. Then something happened. His voice detached itself from his defenses and came to stand between us all, like a thin man who had decided to be brave, even if the wind had different ideas. I have used my name for things it did not deserve, he said. I am late to this truth. There are costs to late truths. They will be paid. I do not ask you to like me. I ask you to hear me. I ask you to ask me again. If you suspect me of forgetting any of this, as soon as I leave these holy stones. He spoke of the ledger. He spoke of the note I could find in the dark now, the way you can find the switch in your own house, even in a thunderstorm. He spoke of budgets and seasons, of his father and their alliances, of the arithmetic they chose, because it gave them the answer they wanted. He did not say my name. He did not say Daniel's. I watched his mouth try to make space for them and decide to keep space instead. Bring it, said someone near the back. I think the blacksmith. Who remembers when weight behaves? And I stood, the ledger in my hands, and walked it up the aisle like a child to be baptized in facts. My knees felt like Sunday school. I opened to the page, cleared my throat, and read. The words left me and hung high under the rafters, where the swallows think they live on special terms. And then they fell gently into the ears of people who now knew what they had paid for weddings. They were never invited to. Silence is not all alike. This was the kind that comes when a toe touches water expected to be cold and discovers it is exactly body temperature. Then the questions began. Not shouted, some of them not even questions. The foreman's voice did the work while his hands regretted their history. How many checks did we not do? A mother asked. Was my boy's ladder broken because somebody needed wine? Someone near the font said, shame, and it landed in the aisle like a folded shirt. Charles rose. When a woman at the side, Mrs. Hargreaves, who has a name like a pie that breaks your heart, asked if the rot had been blessed by auditors. We have internal mechanisms, he said, the room wincing at the word we. We are reviewing. We recommend refraining from premature conclusions. He is the sort of man who uses the word premature to swaddle the word truth. It was not lost on the church that the son spoke in comforts and the father in cuts. Lady Evelyn surprised me. She stood and did not look at her husband or her boy. I knew less than I pretended, she said, and then softly, I am sorrier than I will ever be believed for. There was no applause, no outrage, only the sound of the town making space for new information, cautious folding of indignation into grief. Ruth, the vicar said, and I understood. I stepped to the front, placed my hand on the wood where children rest their fingers before being told to hush, and told the room what steel feels like when it meets a son's rib. I told them about Tuesdays and how little wind it takes to make a scaffold. Remember, it isn't a sky. I spoke Daniel's name, and my throat ached in that good way, the way muscles ache when you have climbed a hill and you can see your house from where you stand. My dear, I said, and I rarely say it to a room, only to one pair of ears at a time, only when I mean to put a blanket over someone. If you have ever been asked to carry the cleverly hidden price of someone else's dinner, I see you. We will not be invisible together. That was when Arthur did the terrible and the right. The two being siblings, you meet at the same party. He turned to me, in front of everyone, and said my name, Ruth, as if we were still children, stealing cherries in the pantry that smelled of someone else's bacon. I have paperwork. I have resigned where I can. I have ousted where I cannot resign without sending cowardice a fruit basket. I will sell land my name has never stepped on. The lawyers are sharpening their knives on me as we speak. Let them. They forget that when you are old, you have finally learned where your skin is and what to do when someone wants it. I ask only. No, I will not ask. I will state. We will pay. We will do the work. We will not call it charity. We will not call it generous. We will call it owed. The air changed then. Not forgiveness, not even approval. It was the sort of air rooms make when they have just decided not to look away. A low communal hum, each body could name differently. Some called it relief, some called it danger. I called it the house's cousin. We left the church in a drizzle that gave your face the choice of tears without committing you to sorrow. You must forgive me. I am an old woman, and rain still feels like permission. The baker pressed a loaf into my arms and would not accept my coins. Men like him know when not to ruin a moment with mathematics. The blacksmith touched the brim of a hat he had no business owning and pretended that meant something. The widow squeezed my elbow and did her best to glare at me affectionately, without ruining her reputation for being made of nettles. Arthur stood on the steps, as if they might change their mind and carry him back inside, where the honesty had behaved itself politely under the arches. Outside, truth becomes feral. Charles was on a telephone, telling someone named William that things had gotten sticky. Lady Evelyn stared at the sky and found nothing there to excuse her. Ruth, Arthur said, and he had to reach for the name in his pocket to find it under the lint and the receipts. May I come by later? I would like to. Stop asking, I said. Start doing. Go to the contractor's office. Ask for the list of men who fell and stopped falling, only because the ground did what it always does. Bring a pen. There's a man named Alfie who never returns to a room he wasn't invited into. Invite him. And then, here I let myself. Be cruel because kindness without edges is soup with no salt. Come to my house with your granddaughter. His whole face arranged itself around that last word. Lydia, a girl with spring for eyes, I said. Bring her. The lion would like to ask her something. My dear, before I continue, if you're still here, if any of this is, sitting beside you, the way grief sits beside a widow on a bus, do subscribe and stay with me. There's a part of the house I have never told anyone about, not even Thomas. You may as well be the first. He came that afternoon. Not late, not early, in a coat that remembered the church and did not want to be seen again. And with him, a child whose shoes made decisions and whose hair refused to be taught obedience by anyone but the wind. Lydia took my hallway like it had been waiting for her small, fierce feet. She stopped at the colored patch on the floor where the stained glass throws its little theater. Blue, gold, a red that startles you into admitting you're alive. She put her hand in the lion's mouth before anyone could warn her not to. She didn't speak to it like adults do, in jokes. She didn't pose bravado. She whispered something like a name and something like a spell. Careful, darling, Arthur said, reaching too quickly, because men who have watched stocks run in the wrong direction never quite recover from the twitch. Lydia ignored him as, girls must if they want to grow into women who are free. What does he keep in there? She asked me. Things he hasn't decided to give up yet, I said. Secrets mostly, old coins, the courage of men who have been drinking. He feels sad, she said, withdrawing her hand empty. And the lion, if you can imagine such a thing, looked chastened. He wants to cough. Do you now? I asked the brass beast. Because dignity has no place where children are telling the truth. And I pressed my finger against the mechanism, hidden in his jaw, that my mother's cousin showed me once, under the pretense of fixing a leak. I had forgotten it was there. No, that's not true. I had let myself believe the house would tell me when to remember. It had chosen a child to give us the cue. The lion coughed. Really. A tiny sound, the tisk, of metal on metal. Something clicked. The way locks click when a key they have been waiting for arrives after being lost in the lining of a coat. A small roll of paper slid forward, damp with time and the condensation of secrets. Lydia squealed the beautiful squeal only small girls and grown women who have decided to finally leave can make. Arthur stepped back, as if the paper might contain letters that bite. I took it in my old hands, hands that have held babies and bread and debts, and unrolled it. It was my handwriting, and it wasn't. Do you know that feeling? The shape of yourself in an alphabet you did not write. My name was at the bottom. The R coiling like a snake that had tried optimism once and found it did not suit. The ink was less black than it had been when it ruined my apron. The date was a month before the wedding. The message, what I had been accused of all those years ago. Inventory of stolen goods. The tally of a maid gone rogue. A silver spoon. 3 cherries. 2 eggs. 1 slice of ham. Petty theft that could be flogged at a dinner table while the violins rehearsed. My breath left as if it had seen something in the window that made staying impolite. I stared until the words unclenched and let me into the spaces between them. That's where the truth lives. In the space you leave because you do not know you are lying. The curls, the edges. Mine copied. My habits mimicked, but the slant too. Precise. The confidence too pleased with itself. A boy's practiced forgery has smudges. A woman's righteous lie has flour on it. This had none of that. It had the tidy cruelty of someone who had all day and no conscience. Beneath my name, a note in a hand I had seen before in the ledger upstairs, filed per Lady Ashdown, the mother, not the wife, the matriarch with her laugh like a locked drawer. I looked at Arthur and watched recognition burn him from the inside out. I have seen men catch fire like that on the docks when lanterns and ignorance meet. This was slower. This was a man reading the explanation for the particular shape of his own cowardice. She told me, he said, voice a thread. She told me you... He stopped, because he had sense enough now to be ashamed of finishing that sentence. He took the paper like it weighed nothing and everything. He traced my R as if it would lead him home. She kept this. She put this here. Why would she put it here? So the house would keep it safe, I said. So no one could accuse her of destroying evidence. So she could pose honesty without practicing it. Or Lady Evelyn's voice from the doorway where I had not seen her arrive. Or she put it where only Ruth would ever know to look. The pantry girl your mother framed was the one who knew the lion's trick. The only way to clear her, years later, was to trust the house to confess itself when it had a chance. I hadn't expected to want to thank Lady Evelyn. Life keeps novelty in a pocket. Brings it out for you when you're tired of all your old opinions. I looked at her. She looked at the lion. She knew. Evelyn said, and even the lion did not ask who she meant. She knew you were honest. She needed your honesty to legitimize her lie. That's always the way. Arthur sat on the bench by the door. He looked small in a way I had envied him the possibility of being. My mother, he whispered. And I wanted to help him. And I wanted to stand back and applaud the nettles that had finally decided to be nettles. Lydia reached for my hand, not his. Is the lion happy now? She asked. He is relieved, I said. Happiness will need more time. Tell me, my dear, have you ever held a proof in your hand and felt both vindication and hunger? Vindication, because the world shaped like The thing you suspected is finally standing in your hallway without its coat. Hunger. Because even proof does not feed you the meal you were denied 50 years ago. If this has happened to you, write to me under this story. I will read your name aloud to the lamp. The day did what days do, when too much has happened in a small square of time. It insisted upon tea. I poured for Evelyn. I chose a cup with a crack that had never failed me. She took it with the careful delight of a woman who has never trusted herself not to drop something precious. Lydia explored the house like a cat that had been a queen in another life and was willing to pretend it wasn't now. Arthur stared at the ledger and the letter and the lion. Men who have made money by assigning value are always at sea when a coin arrives they cannot identify. There was a knock on the door, a real one this time, not 3 taps rehearsed by guilt. It was Daniel. He stepped into the colored light and made it his. The stained glass seemed relieved to have a subject worth painting. He saw Arthur, saw Evelyn, saw the child, saw me. His face changed with such delicacy. I wanted to cover him with my cardigan and ask the world to try again later when it had learned some manners. I heard you were here, he said to Arthur, and it was not a question. He looked at me. How are you doing, Ma? I'm doing, I said, which is the bravest a woman can be when bravery has been putting her to bed and waking her up for longer than she remembers. He turned to Lydia and crouched, a movement that is always a sermon when a man in pain performs it for a child. Hello, he said. I'm Daniel. That's a very fine lion you've made your friend. He's sad, she reported. Aren't we all, he said, winking in the way that makes little girls decide the world isn't as stupid as everyone says. Arthur rose. Daniel, he began, and I watched the names of all the men he hadn't been rise in his throat and obstruct his air. I owe you. You owe a lot of people, Daniel said, not unkind, and that was the first moment I wanted to lie down on the anonymous tiles and cry for the ways my boy had been forced to be better than men. He had to ask for wages. But you must do something for me first. Not money, not apologies. You must answer a question. Arthur nodded, helpless in the way men are when a question has already decided to eat them. Ask. Daniel looked at me, and I saw the boy who once hid under the table during a thunderstorm and asked me if the gods were bowling or arguing. I saw the man who had watched me sleep to make sure my breathing did not decide to go on holiday without notice. I saw 1,000 dinners we had refused to ruin with politics and truth. I thought he would ask about bracing, about steel, about names on documents, and the way signatures multiply like bad ideas. He did not. He asked the thing that had lived in his spine longer than the pain. Are you my father? There was no wind in the hallway then, and the colors on the floor pulled their skirts in, and even the lion hid his teeth. The house held its breath, the way it does when lightning is about to introduce itself to the tree at the edge of the garden. Arthur's hand moved towards the back of the bench, towards steadiness, and then didn't. Lady Evelyn put her cup down, not because it was heavy, but because her hands had forgotten how to be innocent. Lydia watched me, not the men, with spring eyes that understood rain. My dear, forgive me. I am old and my heart still startles. If this story has your hands where mine are, on the banister, steadying, wanting to know and fearing, it all the same. Stay with me. Subscribe if you wish. I will not make you wait for nothing. It is only that the truth, like bread, should never be delivered raw. I looked at my son, my only always, and I decided to be the woman I wanted him to believe. I am. My mouth opened and I let it be church and field and kitchen. Yes, I said. Yes, Daniel, he is. Silence does a strange thing to a room. It gathers itself like a shawl around everyone present and decides who will feel warm and who will itch. After I said it, "Yes, he is," the quiet spread to the skirting boards and climbed the stairs. The stained glass laid its red on the floor like a question you could trip over if you weren't careful. I felt the house lean its ear. Daniel did not look at Arthur first. He looked at me. It is a kindness sons grant their mothers when the world tries to tell them their history has been incorrectly captioned. His mouth shaped a boy's word and a man's breath. "Say it again," he asked, very softly, as if the truth were a bird we might frighten. I did. "Yes," I repeated, placing my hand flat against my own chest, so he would know the sound was being made where it mattered. "He is your father." Arthur's fingers found the back of the bench as if wood could. Teach him how to be steady. Lady Evelyn closed her eyes and opened them, and when she did, something enormous left her face and hovered over the umbrella stand for a moment, before it dispersed itself into the dust like an old perfume. Lydia watched me, like children do when they finally understand. Grown-ups are telling the truth, even when it hurts. Daniel drew a breath that negotiated with his ribs. "Did Thomas know?" he asked. "He knew," I said. "From the first. He knew from the way you yawned like him, and the way you learned to use your left hand when your right was busy. He knew because I told him before he asked. And he asked me kindly. He said a child should be fathered by a man who shows up with bread, not words." My voice faltered, and I placed it back on its feet. "He asked only one thing of me. That I tell you when you asked, not before. That I let you grow into the size of the answer." Daniel nodded, his jaw working the way claws work at a knot. "He left me because I was poor," I said in my head, hearing the old sentence wearing new clothes. "And now he can't afford my forgiveness." But the words stayed where they belonged, in me, not in Daniel's ear. "My dear," I murmured, "to you listening, more than to myself, if this story has touched your heart even a little, do subscribe and stay with me. Some truths are a little easier when you know someone is sitting in the front pew. Even if I can't see your face." Daniel's eyes moved to Arthur at last. There was so much I could see happening in him that no camera would have caught. The accounting of 1,000 small moments he suddenly had to reprise. The rearrangement of furniture in a room he'd lived in without noticing where the chair had always been too close to the door. He stood as if the weight of standing and sitting had become equal. "You don't get to be my dad," he said, and his voice did not tremble. "Bless it. I had a father." He whistled when he was pretending not to swear. He gave me his scarf, and his last piece of sausage, and his softest yes. His name was Thomas. He took a breath. "But you can be the man I'm related to. You can do that by doing things. You do not get to call me son." Arthur's face did a thing I've only ever seen once, in a mirror, the week after Daniel was born. It lost all the arrangements it used to wear, and showed itself unclothed and undecorated. He nodded. He did not try to argue himself into a different version of the day. He did not reach for me to translate. He sat very still inside his coat and wore his shame properly, like a garment you keep because it's the only one that fits the truth. "There's a letter," I said, into the space where more words would be a kind of violence if they came, from anyone else. "From Thomas, for you. He wrote it the night we decided to marry. He said I should give it to you when the lion coughed." Lydia clapped once. "He coughed," she said, delighted, as if the world were an obedient trick dog. "Third stair," I told Daniel. "The one that groans like an old man who's been made to stand in line too long. On the left, near the wall, there's a nail that looks different from its brothers. Press it in and then pull." He went to the staircase, the way one approaches an altar, reverent, skeptical, ready to be surprised. His fingers found the nail immediately. It is always the children of a house who know where it hides itself. and he pressed. The board lifted, its edge like a conjurer, eager not to be caught showing how the trick works. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that still smelled faintly of the shed, lay an envelope with his name. To Daniel, in Thomas's hand. The T like a man who always stands when a lady enters, even when nobody is looking. He sat on the step and opened it, and because the world is sometimes kind to old women, he read it aloud. My boy, Thomas, had written, "If you are reading this, it means your mother has told you the truth you were always big enough to carry. I knew before you were born. In the way men know things, they learn by choosing them. A father is the man who shows up. I chose you in the morning and again, after tea, and again when the boards complain at night, because you want the glass of water that is really a look at the moon. If one day the man whose blood you share shows up a better man than the boy who left, then meet him as an equal, not as a beggar. He cannot buy what he did not build. He can mend what he broke, if you let him, but the price is his to pay, not yours to discount. Be good to your mother. She has made a cathedral out of a kitchen. Be kinder than the men whose names are printed, and taller than the grudges that will try to wear your coat." Daniel's voice failed, and I finished the last line for him. We had all but memorized it, we who had never heard it. P.S. If the lion coughs again, tell him I've forgiven him for biting me that one winter. We laughed then, the whole room, in that wet-eyed, ridiculous way. People laugh when the dam has admitted it cannot hold, but will try to destroy nothing on its way down. Laughter is the only shorthand for certain kinds of mercy. Even the lion's brass teeth looked less certain of themselves. Daniel folded the letter, the way you fold a flag. He tucked it into his pocket, as if he was returning a borrowed dignity. He stood and turned to Arthur. "I will not be your son," he said gently, "but I will be the man who answers your phone calls, if they are about the men on the site, and not about your loneliness. Do you understand?" "I do," Arthur said, and the sound of him meant it. "Good," Daniel said. "Now what are you going to do next? Not to feel better, but to make better?" Arthur blinked, grateful for an instruction. "I've started selling the land in the north," he said, like a schoolboy reporting a chore, finished without being told twice. "The board will call it foolish. Let them. I've put aside a fund. No one's name on it, not mine. Not charity, a duty. Safety first, then wages. Then the odd repairs to old houses. We should have kept our promises to already. I'm asking the town to choose the trustees." Lady Evelyn spoke, and it was a softer tone than I had ever heard her use in public. "And I am resigning from the board of anything with our name on it," she said. "I am done lending it the kind of respectability that smells like lilies and has dirt under it." Charles hadn't spoken since the church. He was staring at the lion as if it had insulted his tie. "You think any of this absolves you?" he asked his father, and the contempt in his voice had been years in rehearsal. "Resignations and funds. You risk bringing the entire house down." "Some houses," I said, since nobody had invited me, and the house had, "need to come down to see what their foundations are made of." He turned that handsome boredom on me. "I could take this house back," he said. "There are clauses." "Are there?" I answered, the way old women do when they decide a boy needs to be reminded of the difference between law and a door you can't get through. "Your mother knows the clauses. Ask her how I came to own it. Ask her who insisted the codicil name me. Ask her why." He looked startled at that, and Evelyn, to her credit, did not hide. "Because my mother-in-law lived long enough to understand that decency is cheaper at the beginning," she said. "Because she dressed her shame in penance, and hoped a woman like me would finish what she couldn't stand to start. Because Ruth returned a watch with money in it, and never touched the coin. And I wanted to make sure that kind of honesty had a roof it could live under without Rain getting ideas. Charles opened his mouth, discovered nothing reasonable lived there, and closed it again. Lydia, who fears very little except the improbable threat of having to sit still, tugged his sleeve with the exact sternness of a small queen addressing one of her knights. "You should say sorry to the lion," she announced. "You spoke rude in his hallway." To my surprise, Charles did. He muttered something to the brass that could have been apology or a list of wines he intended to drink that evening. Either way, the lion accepted, because lions know the difference between theatrics and tribute. "My dear, tell me, I ask you now, because a good story keeps your hands busy, so your heart can hear itself. Have you ever forgiven someone who broke your heart? Not in the way that wins you points, but in the quiet, splinter by splinter way that lets you sweep without bleeding? Put your story in the comments. I read them when the house goes to sleep. We made tea. That is not a metaphor. We made actual tea." Evelyn took her cup like a confessor takes a secret. Arthur held his with both hands, as if the steam might offer absolution. Daniel stood by the window and let the light argue with his spine and lose. Lydia lay on the carpet in the coloured patch and made swimming motions with her arms, red on blue on gold, as if she knew the house would let her keep summer longer than weather does. "Do you remember?" Evelyn asked me suddenly, her eyes on the portrait of nobody that had watched our lives with a patience bordering on rudeness. "The day we first spoke, I remember you looked like you had swallowed a handkerchief," I said, "and you called me miss when your friends were listening." "I came to your room once," she said, "years ago. I didn't knock. You were not there. I sat on the chair where you mended, and I looked at the needle left sleeping in your bib. I nearly took it. As a souvenir, as a self-punishment. I didn't. I left my brooch on your dresser instead. Did you ever find it?" "I found a brooch," I admitted. "I sold it to pay the midwife." Evelyn smiled without her mouth. "Good," she said. "I hoped you did." The house hummed then. Not the pipes, not the wind. The house. Houses hum when secrets have decided to leave them, and the wood is lighter for it. The portrait tilted itself a fraction you wouldn't notice, unless you have slept in this hallway for 60 years and know its habits like the backs of your own widowed hands. "Ruth," the house said, by way of a small settling of the frame. "Behind." I cannot explain how houses speak to those who have paid the rent with their lives, but they do. I took the portrait down. The wall behind was not blank. It had a square cut into it long ago and papered over with care that had not expected to be found out. I pressed. The square opened. The smell that came from inside was cedar, and a song I hadn't heard since my mother was alive and broke thread. With her teeth, there was a box, not a grand one, a simple wood with dovetail corners, the kind a man makes when he thinks his penance should be elegantly useful. Inside, folded in blue tissue that had kept the memory of colour better than the colour itself, a letter addressed to me, to the girl who knows how to open locked drawers, in a hand that had learned to write its own name as if it were an apology, Clementine Ashdown. Arthur made a sound. It was not quite a groan. It was not quite a prayer. It was the noise you make when the last piece of furniture in a familiar room introduces itself as a stranger. I opened the letter. The paper lifted as if it were tired of holding on. "Ruth," it began, "I lied about you because I did not trust my son to survive wanting you. I lied because I was a coward dressed like a mother. I taught him to be so well behaved he forgot the difference between behavior and goodness. I forged your hand because I had practiced forging my own happiness for so long that theft looked like housekeeping. When I learned you'd left, I told myself I had saved the house. I did not ask which house. Years later, when the doctor told me I only had the length of one winter left, I went into the pantry to weep, and the lion glared at me. I put the proof, where only God and women could find it. I asked Evelyn to watch the will when I might not. I did not do this to be forgiven. I did it because this house deserves to stop pretending it is holy, while being held together by other people's secrets. I stopped. I had to. My eyes had filled my throat. She wrote another page, Lydia said. I can hear it. She was right. Under the first page, another, thinner, almost transparent with time. I have a granddaughter too, Clementine had, written, years before Lydia was thought of. Though she is not mine by blood, she is every girl who has ever taken someone else's tray into a room where laughter doesn't pay for anything. See her. Give her the house if you can. Houses should belong to those who know where the leaks are. Evelyn's shoulders unlearned, a posture they had been practicing since 1960. Arthur put his hand over his mouth and found he could not hold the sound in. Charles sat down because standing was suddenly beyond his education. Mother, he said, as if the letter were the woman, what did you do? What we all did, Evelyn replied, taking the words as if they belonged to more than one ghost. We learned late. Outside, the sky remembered its job and darkened. The house put its lamps on without me, the way an old friend tucks a blanket over your knees while you pretend you were not shivering. I thought of the blue door we had promised each other once upon a pantry. I thought of the blue tissue in the box and the way promises keep the color of themselves, even when you can no longer tell what shade they were. Ruth, Arthur said then, so quietly we might have missed it, I cannot afford your forgiveness. No, I answered, and it was not cruel. It was accurate, and accuracy is a kindness when used with care. But you can afford Lydia's future. You can afford the truth. You can afford to sit in this house without asking it to be your alibi. You can afford to be the man Thomas had the courtesy to imagine you might become. That will do. My dear, before I continue, if any part of this day has put your heart in your mouth, breathe with me. If you're willing, subscribe and stay through the next bit. I am going to tell you about the night the town wrote with its feet, and about the one thing I gave Arthur that he did not deserve and still needed. Arthur came the next day without a coat. It was raining the mean, pinning rain that finds holes in your resolve. He was wet as truth. He stood on my step, no knock, and placed a folder at the lion's feet like an offering. The fund, he said, voice rasped clean by weather. The trustees' names, the first transfers. Daniel refused a penny for himself. He suggested, the name. He swallowed, and the house listened on purpose. The Blue Door Fund. I looked at my boy, my only always, standing a step behind him, damp-haired from a walk he hadn't wanted. He shrugged, but his eyes were a celebration, held in secret. We build the door we were promised, he said. For the next kids, for the ones who work 6 floors up, so somebody else can point at the skyline and take credit. Good, I said. Bring me a loaf. I'll make soup. Men cannot move financial mountains on an empty stomach. We ate, the 3 of us, and I am not romanticizing. There is a holiness to soup when it is bowl and balm. Arthur took the second helping, without asking if he might. That was new. We spoke of scaffolding as if it were theology. We spoke of audits like neighbors. When he stood to go, he did not kiss me. We are too old for certain graces. He put his hand on the back of the chair Thomas had always taken and said, to the empty air that wasn't empty at all, I'm sorry, Tom. The house approved. The pipes performed a tiny amen. There was, of course, a letter the next morning with an expensive crest and a cheap heart, an injunction, a threat, a list of consequences. If I did not surrender the ledger to the proper authorities, by which they meant the men who had built their fortunes, on the spine of a town and did not like the idea of that town growing its own. Charles had signed it, C. Ashdown, with the satisfaction of a boy who thinks his alphabet outranks his mother's. I put the letter in the drawer under the teacups, with the other things that argue for a living. Then I took the ledger, kissed its spine like a book of psalms, and wrapped it in brown paper. I scrawled a name on it that was not mine. Mrs. Hargreaves, the widow with the broom and the secret soup. If you want something to disappear without being lost, give it to a woman who has been underestimated. We were not finished. Of course we were not. Stories like this do not end with funds and letters and a lion regurgitating guilt. They end with a town deciding who it wants to be. They end with dinners that do not taste the same because someone took their hands out of their pockets and put them in the air and said, I did this. They end with a granddaughter asking if she can keep visiting the house because the windows tell stories better than television. That night, as the rain worked on the roof and the house slept in sections the way old things must, there was a gentle knock, not 3 taps of guilt, not the officious rap of legal consequences, a knock like a postcard. When I opened it, the porch light painted the visitor in that careful yellow that makes everyone's sins look softer. A girl stood there, no older than the truth and no younger than a question. Not Lydia, another, black, curls, a coat with a tear that had been mended by someone who either loved her or had decided to try the feeling on. She held a parcel wrapped in oilcloth and string, the kind of parcel that remembers being a loaf in a different life. Are you Ruth? She asked. I have been for a long time, I said. She handed me the parcel. A man at the docks told me to bring this to the lady in the big house with the lion that coughs when it's honest. He said you would understand. He said his name was Alfie. I took the parcel. It was heavier than something that size should be. The knot on the string had been tied by hands that made careful decisions about rope for a living. Do you know what's inside? I asked. Because I always ask. Because you should teach children the pleasure of saying yes or no on purpose. She shook her head. Only that it's something the town should see, she said, and that you wouldn't let it be taken by people who spell their ignorance with stationery. I smiled, because she had just used up the next 24 hours of my strength, with a sentence that deserved a biscuit. Come in, I said. Have you eaten? She grinned, relieved by the sudden predictability of old women. Not since breakfast, she said. Then you're exactly the guest this house prefers. I told her, and the lion, I swear, purred. We untied the string, Alfie's knot reluctantly granting us jurisdiction. Inside, a ledger's twin, newer, less proud of itself, and a sheaf of letters on onion skin paper that felt like a whisper. Minutes, the top page declared, in a hand that did not expect to pay for itself. Informal, do not circulate, names, meetings, votes made by the kind of men who will never set foot on the beams their pens condemn. And there, in a margin, the initials again, C. Ashdown, not Clementine, not the old lord, not even Charles. A date barely a fortnight before the wind that took my boy's ease. Beside it, in a different hand, a note, Call CA, says expedite despite forecast. We'll weather it. The house did a thing I have never felt it do before. It bristled. It stood, every nail in it suddenly a spine. Evelyn, who had returned for tea and stayed for truth, reached for the papers with a face that had earned its changes. Arthur closed his eyes, not to pretend none of this was happening, but to push back tears that would not help. Daniel put his hand on the girl's shoulder and smiled at her as if she had just delivered him a piece of himself. I pressed my palm flat on the table to steady the flood. Then I looked at you, as I am looking now, through the lens that is not glass, but attention, and I said, "My dear, are you still with me? Stay. Subscribe if you want to follow this river. Tell me where you are. US, UK, Canada, Australia. Tell me how your rain sounds tonight." The next step is louder than a church full of names, and the house at last is ready to roar. The square answered the house. The vicar rang the bell until every window in town remembered how to open. We brought the parcel, the ledger, the onion skin minutes. The men whose names have always travelled farther than their work tried to stay home and discovered their feet had other plans. We read the line aloud, the margin note with its swagger. "Cool CA, says expedite despite forecast. We'll weather it." The words were simple, the way knives are. Arthur didn't flinch. Evelyn did not hide. Charles stepped forward to claim the initial as coincidence, then stumbled over the docklog Alfie had kept, a page of times and calls that fit the storm like a cruel glove. Nobody shouted, "We are not that town." We are the kind that lets facts do the heavy lifting, while we watch to make sure they don't drop anything. The foreman stood, voice calm, hands trembling, and cast the vote 100 throats echoed. Remove, refer, repair. The board emptied itself of its son. Papers were filed that afternoon by people who don't like paperwork, but dislike broken ribs more. The fund met its first trustees, all selected by the town. A nurse who counts pennies like promises. A carpenter who will measure twice, even when nobody's looking. Mrs. Hargreaves with her broom and her soup and her spine. By dusk, the bell was quiet and the air had that rinsed look it gets after the truth has been hung out and allowed to drip. Arthur walked beside me without speaking, coat unbuttoned to the weather he'd once called an inconvenience, and now considered a teacher. We stopped at the churchyard gate. He rested a palm on Thomas's stone and said the only sentence that mattered. I stayed. It wasn't for me. It was a message left in the one place men tell the truth without needing witnesses. We painted the door. Lydia insisted on the colour, the exact wild blue of the tissue in Clementine's box, the exact tender blue of a promise repaired. She held the brush with both hands, the way small queens hold sceptres. Daniel laughed when the paint spotted his boots, the kind of laugh that fixes small things in you that doctors can't reach. The lion watched, approving, a brass sentinel, finally satisfied to guard something finished. Do you want to know what I did with forgiveness? I didn't spend it like the rich spend at auctions, waving it in the air to end the noise. I locked it in the drawer with the teacups and took it out only when it was needed to sweeten something that would otherwise be bitter. A signature on a fund transfer. A meeting where men listened instead of waiting to talk. The first morning, Charles walked past the square with his collar open, and no one crossed the street to avoid him. Because mercy is not the same as forgetting, Arthur asked me once, just once more. In my kitchen with his hands around a mug, he now washed himself without being told, "Can you forgive me?" "No," I said, and he closed his eyes the way people do when the sea speaks, and they finally decide to listen. "I can release you," I added. "I can feed you. I can call you by your first name and not mean a boy anymore. But forgiveness, the kind you're imagining, is not for sale here. It's for the dead and for God. What I have is the door." I nodded to the blue and let the light find it. "Walk through it. Keep bringing people with you." He did. Not always neatly, not always bravely. He sold land he'd never touched. He refused dinners he once mistook for duty. He wrote checks and then learned the names of the men the checks were for. He stood at the back of meetings and spoke last. He carried a list in his pocket for the days he forgot what mattered, and read it like a prayer. He learned to be poor, in the one currency he had always hoarded, excuse, and Daniel, my only always, became the trustee who never lets a vote end without a story attached to it. He still will not take a penny for himself. But when the surgeon in town needed a grant to bring a new machine that teaches spines to forget what Tuesdays can do to them, he took my hand and said, "If they call it charity, I'll spit. If they call it ode, I'll lie down and let it work." It worked. He walks differently now, not because pain left, but because dignity learned a better route. The dock girl, her name is Nia, comes on Thursdays to help me in the kitchen and to examine the lion as if he were a patient, and she the doctor he deserves. She's apprenticed with the blacksmith. Her hands are learning to bend metal out of its worst ideas. Lydia visits with drawings of doors in every kind of blue you can think of, and some you can't until she names them. She put her palm to the lion's mouth last week and said, "He's hungry again." And I fed him a biscuit because some appetites are just companionship in disguise. As for me, I live here still, in the house that finally believes itself honest. The portrait of nobody watches without judgment. The banister takes my hand, like an old friend on a slow afternoon walk. Some nights I sit by the blue door and count the quiets, the one that belongs to forgiveness, withheld without malice, the one that belongs to work, done without applause, the one that belongs to a woman who once scrubbed a floor and now owns the boards that remember her knees. He left me because I was poor. Now he can't afford my forgiveness, but I can afford my life. I can afford the truth. I can afford, finally, to love the girl. I was enough to turn the lock and let her out into a hallway where the light is something you do, not something you hope for. My dear, before I let you go, if this story has touched your heart even a little, do subscribe and stay with me. Tell me, have you ever forgiven someone who broke your heart? Or did you choose, like me, to release them and keep the word for your own peace? I would like to know if you stayed with me till the end, my dear. Thank you. Tell me the time and country you're watching from in the comments. It warms my old heart knowing where my stories travel.